Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making time for this webinar. This has actually been a widely requested webinar because there's so many people who are starting the conversation about should they convert from desktop to online. And it's a conversation that we've had with a number of our clients over the last few months in particular. And Brad and I actually started talking about this very conversation back at Scaling New Heights in June in Orlando. And I particularly liked the way that VARC Solutions handles conversions because it seems such a no nonsense practical approach to conversions. And so I thought it was really important to have that conversation with him here today. And so with that, I'm going to quickly introduce ourselves. Brad White is here with us. He has over 25 years of experience in the industry, and we were trying to decide exactly how many conversions he's actually overseen. We think it's hundreds. Might be higher than that, but right now we're going with hundreds.
Definitely hundreds. Yeah.
Yeah. He's located outside of Friendswood, Texas, which is actually near Houston, correct?
Yeah. South Houston.
All right. And at VARC Solutions, they work with clients from all industries across the United States. And my name is Jerry Frank, and I'm CEO of STRATAFOLIO. And if you don't know what STRATAFOLIO does, we work with companies who own and manage commercial real estate and use QuickBooks. But with that said, let me jump into what we're actually going to cover today. So, what you're going to learn about today is how to avoid those migration pitfalls, most importantly, some data transfer and prep tips, the optimal setup configuration, how you validate and optimize for future usage, and then we will have some time at the end where you can ask Brad some Q&A about his experience, what he would suggest on certain things. And along the way, I may also drop in a few questions as we go. From a housekeeping perspective, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available later to everyone. And I will keep an eye on the Q&A, but we're primarily going to wait until the very end because there is a lot to get through in this 25-minute session. So with that, let's kick it off, Brad.
Sounds great.
Oops.
All right. So you want me to go ahead and just get started just with the content?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, perfect. So first off, hi everybody. Thanks Jerry for inviting me to be part of the not the podcast, but the webinar. Yeah, this is a topic that comes up a lot. Like you said, we do a lot of these migrations every single week, every single month, and so have a lot of experience getting people from desktop to online. Obviously, know the pitfalls, know some of the mistakes that people make, what they've tried to do on their own versus what we typically do, things like that. And so yeah, in terms of like some of the mistakes, let's just talk about reviewing the legacy data first. Just some of the basics of cleaning up your data before you migrate. One of the whole concepts, whether we're doing a bookkeeping cleanup or a migration cleanup, what have you, what if you have a mess in one system, you don't want to migrate that mess somewhere else. Okay, that's just a bad way to do it. Okay, so and most of the clients that we work with come to us with some level of mess. You might have customers that haven't been used in years, unused list entries, unused items, unused vendors, and things like that should be made inactive, right? So you're not migrating inactive customers. Worst thing in the world is be using QuickBooks for 10 years, have a list 1,000 customers and only 20 active ones, and you're migrating all of them. So make them inactive if you're not using them. That's just a good best practice. And then things like reconciling, it still baffles me a little bit when we look at a company's files and they haven't reconciled their bank account in 5 months or reconciled their credit card accountants in 2 years or their loan accounts ever, things like that. And generally speaking, you want to have your accounts reconciled up to the most current month before you migrate. Again, because that process of reconciling helps you find things that are not, have never cleared the bank. Mistakes that, haven't been reconciled in the bank account within QuickBooks, and you don't want to migrate those mistakes to to another environment. You're just moving the mess. So that's one thing. Those are just some basic cleanups before you do the migration. Okay. Number two is to understand the feature differences. And this is one of the most surprising things for folks is that, you're on QuickBooks Desktop, you're trying to move to QuickBooks Online, both say QuickBooks, you think it's going to be the same, but it's not. It's very, very different. QuickBooks Desktop and QuickBooks Online are incredibly different. It always kind of shocks me when people say, yeah, they're kind of the same, aren't they? No, they're not. They're very different. Not just in terms of look and feel, but also functionality. There are features in QuickBooks Desktop, as well as Desktop Enterprise, that just don't exist in QuickBooks Online. Some that may or may not apply within the commercial property management space, but just since we're talking about industries in general, things like inventory assemblies, build of materials in desktop, that whole concept doesn't even exist in online. There used to be a time when sales orders weren't even in the online system. So if a company was coming to us, wanting to migrate and they used sales orders, we would try to make them understand up front that this is a feature that you don't have in online. You might not want to do it just yet until that feature has been built out. So there's feature differences. And that's, by the way, that's not only features that are there and or possibly missing, there's also differences in how those features work. Just as an example, online banking in QuickBooks Desktop, very different how online banking works in QuickBooks Online. So there are differences that you need to be aware of. And maybe those differences are good. And in some of those cases, those differences might not be good, depending on your unique details. So the third one is verifying integrity or compatibility. One of the biggest roadblocks to migrating is a very, very large and or potentially corrupt desktop file. And if you've been using QuickBooks for a year or two, desktop, maybe not a problem. But if you've been using QuickBooks for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, it's very possible that that file is big and has some level of corruption in it. And in QuickBooks Desktop, there's a utility that allows you to verify and rebuild your company file. And at a minimum, I recommend people verify their desktop file to make sure that if there are any corruptions, that it finds those and then tries to repair those. Which, by the way, can be a pretty scary thing for people to even contemplate. It's like, ooh, is it okay to rebuild my data? To me, that would be scary if I wasn't, if we weren't a QuickBooks expert company, right? But those are things that you should do. And then some people will say, well, things like, well, hey, I've got this big file. Should I do an archive and condense within desktop to get the file down? We don't recommend that because yes, it might make the file smaller, but it also creates other issues that we have found, generally speaking, are not advisable, right? We don't recommend that feature, but things like maybe getting rid of the audit trail before you migrate, that would help. And then doing verify rebuild can really absolutely help. Number 4, setting up user access correctly. So again, this is one of those, it's kind of a shock to some people who migrate. If you're on desktop and you've got 10 users with their roles and permissions and they've all been set up and you are tightly controlling who can get in and do certain things, those users and roles and permissions don't migrate to QBO. So they have to be set up and they have to be set up again. So have you documented the current users and roles and permissions so that you can try to replicate that in QBO? By the way, also going into it, knowing that QBO has different setup options when it comes to roles and permissions. So you might not be able to exactly match what you had before in the new system. So those are just things that we try to tell people about in advance, not to scare them, but just to kind of warn them that there are these differences. And then last but not least, on this slide, the automating historical data migration. Let's assume that we've got a file that is convertible. It's small enough to convert and there are no corruptions and you've done some of the things we just talked about, cleaning up the file, reconciling, getting things current. If that is the case, you ought to be able to do a quote unquote automatic migration. so that you kind of click a button and it migrates your file to QBO and everything is intact, including the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years of history in detail. That's a perfect scenario. That's, when that migration works, that's optimal. Everybody wants history. When we talk to people about it, they're like, I want my history.
Yep.
And if I was you, I'd want my history too. But sometimes it's not possible. Again, you're trying to convert and for whatever reason, it says the file is too big or it just stalls during migration because some issue behind the scenes is there. When we encounter those situations, we end up doing what is called a shell file, which is a fancy way of saying we create a brand new QuickBooks Online file. We export lists, import lists. We do journal entries to get opening balances in so that the balances match, the overall financials for the current year match, right? But you don't have the history. And for some people, that's like a deal breaker, like, oh, this is not going to work. But the alternative is to try to migrate that history manually through exporting and importing transactions. We have found pretty consistently that when clients want that, and we have tried to do that, it ends in a nightmare because of a whole host of reasons. But without getting too technical, basically to say it like this, QuickBooks, whether it's desktop or online, is a cohesive system. Everything's kind of connected, right? You've got customers that are connected to invoices, which are connected to payments, which are connected to deposits. And there is no way to recreate that connected data by importing transactions in groups at any level. And so what you end up having is the history, but none of it's connected. And then having to manually connect it is just a nightmare. And most clients don't like the end result. So those are some of the mistakes just to kind of get us started.
Yeah, and Brad, I just want to pick up on that because this was part of our conversation when we were in Orlando when we were talking through this because um, that that bringing over all of that historical data and recreating the connectivity that was there, that goes from a several $1,000 activity to many thousands of dollars to recreate all of that data coming in.
Yeah, and that's not the only problem. So I mean, one, yeah, it becomes a lot more costly. And again, people don't tend to like the result even after paying the money to do it, because of just the volume of transactions that we're talking about have to almost be manually connected and applied and things like that. The other thing that people don't like is how long it takes. So again, if you could do the automatic migration and just kind of click the button and an hour or two later it's everything's there, you're good. But if that migration automatic process doesn't work and now you're faced with let's do this more of a shell file or manually, instead of a 2-hour process, that could now take a 2-week or 3-week or 4-week or 6-week process, depending on how much data is there. And that usually is not viable for most companies. Not touching my accounting records for 6 weeks or 4 weeks or 3 weeks is typically not a viable alternative. And because things just get stacked up, you can't get invoices out, you can't get bills paid, you can't do payroll or whatever. So yeah.
We'll come back to that in a little bit more detail later. But let's go back on to this data migration.
Yeah. Cool. So when it comes to the migration itself, it's also important to understand like what is and isn't migrated. So even if you're doing the automatic migration, where it's sort of just ingesting the entire QuickBooks Desktop file, know in advance that certain things will migrate and certain things won't migrate. So in that category of automatic transfers, your chart of accounts, your customer list, your vendor list, your open invoices and bills, absolutely. Bank transactions, historical data, that'll all come in there. That's automatic. What won't come in is custom fields. Like if you've gone into your customer list or your item list and you've created custom fields, that data won't migrate, which again can be a challenge. Inventory assemblies won't migrate because again, that feature doesn't even exist in QBO. Memorized transactions won't go. So you'll have to recreate the memorized transactions. And again, let's be honest, some companies don't even use memorized transactions, or maybe there's only a handful. I know every month we've probably got over 100 memorized transactions every month. So for us, it'd be a little bit more of a challenge to recreate that. The audit trail won't migrate. So, when you get to the QBO, you'll have a new audit trail that starts accumulating over time. Again, maybe not an issue for some people, but multi-currency, if that's enabled, that will actually prevent the migration from happening as well. Users and permissions also will have to get recreated. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's some things that will and some things that won't. And just knowing that can help prepare you for the, oh crap, I didn't realize we were going to spend another week after this migration doing some of these other things. And by the way, I forgot to mention templates. In QuickBooks Desktop, you can go in and create a fancy invoice template and put the logo and move things around and, do some things like that. Those templates that you might have painstakingly spent hours creating in Desktop, you're going to have to do it all over again in QBO because those things don't migrate as well. So those are some of the automatic versus manual. And then you've got that section there for pre-migration checklist. Again, just some of the things that we mentioned before of reconciling, cleaning up duplicates, merging duplicates. If you've got 2 or 3 different accounts on your chart of accounts, which are really the same thing, and they just accidentally got duplicated or multiple iterations, migrating those or merging those into one, helpful. Custom reports aren't going to convert either. So, if you've created custom reports, if you've customized your icon bar, little things like that are like, oh gosh, I didn't realize that. So I'm going to have to go recreate that.
All right. So this is one of the reasons why I also wanted to bring VARC Solutions to here because of your great migration guide. But let's talk through some of the most common pitfalls that you can avoid.
Okay, so when it comes to the pitfalls, I mean, the biggest and most problematic is having a large file. If you've been using QuickBooks for 10 years, you probably have a large file. You've got bills that have been there for 10 years. You've got invoices, payments, deposits, credit card transactions. I mean, you could have tens of thousands of transactions. QuickBooks Online, the migration, it has a limit in terms of file size and what are called targets. The official language is that if you've got over 750,000 targets, QuickBooks, the migration won't work. Okay. What in the world is a target? Well, think of it as database records, within a database structure. So that means things like customers, vendors, employees, items, invoices, payments, deposits, like literally all of the things. And there's more than that, but that's kind of like the big picture stuff. And yeah, if you got more than 750,000, you just can't migrate. So that's when people start going, well, let me see if I can archive, condense, and get those targets down, which again is something you can try. We just have seen it's getting rid of data that sometimes people don't want to get rid of. Okay. Corrupted data. So this is again one of those sneaky things where what this looks like is you're in QuickBooks Desktop and you're running a report that normally runs, and then all of a sudden it gives you one of these abort, some sort of error message on the screen, and then it closes QuickBooks. And you're like, what in the world happened? And then you go back into Desktop and you go run the same report and it goes bloop, abort. If you've got things like that happening, there's probably some corruption within the data itself somewhere. And a lot of times it's not on the surface. Like you can't just pull up the error log and go, oh, that's the problem, let me go fix it. But there's a verify and rebuild process within a utility within QuickBooks Desktop, and it does work pretty effectively. And sometimes we have to run it like 4 or 5 times in a row until it gets rid of all the problems. And then we've got a lady on our team. She's like I call her my QuickBooks unicorn. Because she can get in kind of behind the scenes and she can usually find and fix some of those things that the automatic tool doesn't fix. So when people come to us, it's because they probably have tried some things on their own and it just hasn't worked. and then we can try to take it to the next level and see if we can get it. Okay.
Yeah.
We've already talked about some of the feature differences, but let me focus a little bit more on the training, the number 4 there. User resistance. We haven't seen as much user resistance with the concept of moving, but in the aftermath of moving, that's when the user resistance typically starts, because they assumed that it was exactly the same. They assumed that the features worked the same, the UI was the same, how they do things was the same, but that is not the case. It is very different in almost every category. It's different. And so what I just try to advise people on is prepare yourself for that and build time into your migration process to train your team. Training is something that we do. We can show people, like, here's how you did it before, here's how you're going to do it in QBO. But build that into your plan. And I personally would suggest, regardless of company size, 2 to 3 hours minimum, just to do the basics. Like, let's walk through your invoicing process in Desktop and let's walk through that in QBO. There's going to be some differences. Just UI differences. How do I add that column that was in Desktop that's not showing up in QBO? Little things like that can, cause things that normally would take 5 hours in a week to suddenly take 15 hours in a week because you're trying to figure it out. So
Right.
2 or 3 hours of upfront training can save you lots and lots of time down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the migration guide. This is free. You guys can go, anybody can go online and get this. It's varcsolutions.com/QuickBooks-migrations. If you go there, you can download the ebook. And what we've tried to do in that book, it's a PDF, is point out some of these specifics so that if you're having that conversation internally about, hey, is it the time to migrate? Is it not the time to migrate? You can at least kind of read through that document and go, ooh, could be an issue for us. Let's learn more about that before you just go, let's do it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, so now you've done it. What are your final steps aside from that training?
So you want to verify that the migration worked. Okay. So, and by the way, when we do this for clients, we do this as well, right? We run before and after financials. We compare balances. If there's any inventory levels at all in terms of like quantities or asset account balances, things like that, you want to verify that. So run the P&L, the balance sheet on both systems on an accrual basis, and make sure that they match. That's one. The second thing is, no matter what you had connected before in Desktop, you're going to have to reconnect that stuff in online. By the way, which is actually an opportunity, because QuickBooks Online bank feeds are much better than the Desktop online banking feature, but you still have to connect your bank accounts and connect your credit cards and connect things like that. And so it just takes a little bit of time to do that, but it will work, and it'll work really, really well for you. But you'll want to connect those things. But then other things like applications, third-party applications that are integrated. Like if you've got STRATAFOLIO connected in Desktop, you're going to have to reconnect that in QuickBooks Online, right? And that's something that obviously, Jerry, you and your team can help with.
Yeah.
But what we have seen is like, hey, I'm using bill.com for my AP automation, and I've got that connected to Desktop. Well, you've got an existing account. It's already connected. Things are synced. And now when you migrate to QBO, literally in that particular case, bill.com support has to get involved to disconnect you and reconnect you and resync, because there's nuances with that connection. What's important to understand about that is some third-party applications integrate with Desktop one way, but when they're connected to QuickBooks Online, they work differently. Sometimes better, and in fact, most of the time better. But some things that you couldn't do before, now you can, and vice versa is also true. So those are just some things to verify. I would verify them in advance, but also after you're gonna have to connect them.
Yeah.
And really, the last thing I'll say related to 3 and 4 there is just take advantage of the efficiencies that are built into QBO. There are some improvements. There are some efficiencies that can be gained. I mean, of course, everybody these days is talking about AI, and QBO is adding more and more AI features that I don't think you're going to see ever in desktop. So there's some things like that that you can really, really start leveraging more in QBO to make it more valuable to you.
Yeah. Well, and to your point around, applications and the reason why so many people want to bring in all of their data into QuickBooks Online is because they want that historical information, that continuity of data. At Stratafolio, so our application works in such a way that people can do a final sync with their desktop, disconnect that, and then for the time going forward, they reconnect QuickBooks Online. So then they have that historical information of their operating income to their cash flow to their tenant payments and invoices. So all that history remains in Stratafolio, so they don't have to keep going back to QuickBooks and opening up that file. All right, so now we're at the point that we can answer some questions, and we did have a couple of questions ahead of time that I did want to get out there. Some people are asking questions about Intuit Enterprise Suite versus QuickBooks Online. Do you want to talk briefly to that, Brad?
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody does have any other questions, put them in the chat or the questions panel for sure. And we'll be happy to answer them either now or afterwards. Yeah, so Intuit actually came out with a new product last year, about a year ago, called Intuit Enterprise Suite. We call it IES for short, and it is basically QuickBooks Online for multi-entity companies, or what Intuit defines as mid-market companies, which I describe as really large SMBs or lower mid-market companies that are in that, let's call it the 1 to 3 million minimum size up to maybe 20 to 50 million in size. And it's a really, really robust and getting better everyday solution for those larger companies. So if you're thinking, well, gosh, why would I migrate to QuickBooks Online? If I'm already feeling like I'm outgrowing QuickBooks, maybe I should be looking at NetSuite, or maybe I should be looking at Sage, which, by the way, are much, much more expensive, take much longer to implement, much costlier to implement. Intuit Enterprise Suite is kind of like migrating to QBO because it's still based on the QBO platform, but it has additional mid-market features and capabilities that are very, very helpful, like dimensional reporting, like intercompany transfers, lots of little things that especially when you get into multi-entities, which I know is popular in commercial property management. So those things like that you can also take advantage of.
So what do you do if a file is not convertible? What do you recommend there?
So if a file is not convertible, okay, what we recommend is first off, I mean, honestly, reaching out to us. We've done hundreds of these. We know how to do it the easiest, fastest, best way. So leverage expertise that you may not have internally. That's my first recommendation. But secondly, your only alternative if the file won't convert is to do what is called a shell file. Okay. You're creating a brand new company file, you're exporting from your desktop file your customer list, your vendor list, your items list, your chart of accounts. You're importing those into QBO, and then you're using effectively journal entries to enter opening balances. Basically, you're running a trial balance in desktop, and you're trying to recreate that trial balance in QBO. There's, again, a whole lots of little details that go along with that, but that's generally the recommendation.
Okay. Well, we have 1 minute left. I will share this as well. So for those that are unfamiliar with Stratafolio, we are the commercial property management layer for anyone who uses QuickBooks. You can use the QR code there to schedule a demo if you're interested in that. And Brad and his team have also shared this preparation guide. Lots of really good information in there for you, so you can take a stab at it, see if it makes sense for you to do, or if you realize after downloading the guide and looking at the steps that, gosh, you don't have the time or the energy to do it, contact the VARC team. Their contact information is on here. This webinar will be available for everyone after the fact. And I appreciate your time, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Take care, everyone.